Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, September 19th, 2023 meeting of the Olympia City Council. This evening we are in a study session. We have two topics. We are going to be leading off with a greenhouse gas inventory and carbon wedge analysis, followed by discussion around our Southeast annexation potential. So at this time, I want to make sure that, for the record, we know that we have a quorum here this evening, although no decisions will be made this evening with Council, as well with Council Madrone excused. So we are going to head off onto item 2A, which is the greenhouse gas inventory. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pamela Braff, who is our Director of Climate Programs, and she will lead us through this.
Thank you, Mayor. My first in-person study session. Yeah. For the record, Pamela Braff, Director of Climate Programs. This evening, I'm really excited to be able to share the results of what we've been working on to develop an Olympia-specific greenhouse gas inventory and a carbon wedge analysis. And so the carbon wedge analysis is really what takes us from here are our emissions, how do we achieve the city's stated climate goals? So we're going to talk about both of those pieces tonight, and there's two reports attached with your staff report. One is the final greenhouse gas inventory, and the other is the draft wedge analysis, which is still in draft form. We're still finalizing that piece of work. So the two items on the agenda tonight, first is the greenhouse gas inventory, and so we're just going to start with a little bit of just basic why and how and what is an inventory, talk about some of the results, and then talk about a contribution analysis, which really looks at why are emissions changing in Olympia. And then the second piece is looking at the wedge analysis, which also here referred to as a reduction or a greenhouse gas reduction strategy analysis. And that includes a couple of components versus our business as usual forecast. So what happens if we don't change anything, and then some options for emissions reduction scenarios. So first up, Olympia's greenhouse gas reduction targets. Anytime we're talking about emissions and strategies to reduce them, it's good to ground ourselves in what the goals are, where are we trying to go. And so working with Lacey and Tumwater and Thurston County, the city has adopted regional reduction targets, 45% below 2015 levels by 2030, and 85% below 2015 levels by 2050. In addition to that, the city has also made some additional climate goals that go beyond that. The first was the Climate Inheritance Resolution, which set a goal to reduce and achieve really net zero emissions by 2040. And then last year, the city also joined the city's Race to Zero campaign, which is saying that the city is going to take the steps necessary to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement and to set an interim 2030 science-based target. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those things. So what are science-based targets? Sometimes we forget to talk about what this actually means. So a science-based target it represents a community's fair share of the ambition necessary to meet the Paris Agreement, which was to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so this is an international treaty that was adopted in 2015. And we know that based on some work that came out after that agreement was made, that in order to achieve that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of limiting warming, the world needs to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And so that interim target is really important, because if we don't hit that interim 2030 target, then even more needs to happen to hit the 2050 target. So it's important to keep both of those in mind. And the other piece that's important here is thinking about what equitable reduction of global emissions look like. Equitably reducing global emissions 50% by 2030 means that high-emitting, wealthier nations who've contributed far more than their fair share take on more of the work to reduce those emissions. And so that's considered when developing science-based targets. So in last year, the city worked with ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, to help calculate Olympia's science-based targets, which was based on our 2019 emissions. And so this takes into account GDP, population, these types of things. And so our absolute SBT, science-based target, is a 59% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And if you look at that per capita, that's a 62.8% reduction in emissions per capita by 2030. So our greenhouse gas inventory and our strategy analysis, I just really want to acknowledge all of the great work that was done by ICLEI to help us develop this. They're just a really fabulous organization, and they have a lot of expertise on staff, and they've created a lot of tools and resources to help local governments who are working on achieving their sustainability goals. And so they've been working with us on this, and they did a lot of the analysis that I'm going to present tonight. And then city staff really led all of the data collection and some of the advising along the way. So the first piece of this is our greenhouse gas inventory. So just to take it way back, I won't go into that much detail, but what is a greenhouse gas? They are the gases in our atmosphere that trap heat like a blanket. They're critical for life on Earth, but when we add too many, they trap more heat than is really consistent with a stable and a livable climate. And increased emissions are what's responsible for climate change. We have a lot of different types of greenhouse gases. The primary ones that you hear about are carbon dioxide, or CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Each of these gases, they all have what we call different warming potential. So they trap different amounts of heat, but CO2, carbon dioxide, is the most common one. It's the most abundant. And so typically when we talk about emissions, we'll report other gases in terms of their CO2e, which is their carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's basically just thinking of a unit of warming. So CO2e is just essentially the warming potential of any group of gases that we're looking at. Greenhouse gas inventories can also vary in their scope as to what they're looking at. So a lot of times these will be framed as scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 emissions. And you can really think of scope 1 as your direct emissions. So these are things from like industrial, you could measure them almost at the site where they're being emitted. So industrial processes that release greenhouse gases, agricultural production, waste, transportation, things like that are considered scope 1. We also have scope 2 emissions. These are indirect emissions from electricity. So they make up a really big source of emissions, but they happen outside of our boundary. Our electricity is produced outside of the city of Olympia, even though we consume it here within the community. And then scope 3 is just it includes a whole bucket of kind of indirect emissions that are related to the things that we're doing. So this is things like waste that might be sent to a landfill outside of the city boundaries, or emissions associated with moving our natural gas before it gets to the city where it's being consumed. And so this is really important because it just kind of sets the stage for what we're including in the inventory. Whenever we're measuring something, we have to decide what's in and what's out. So we used the US Community Protocol. It's called the USCP, which is it's based on an international protocol, which is just a standardized protocol focused on cities doing greenhouse gas inventories. So the USCP is that's the primary nationally accepted methodology for doing this in the US. And it calculates emissions based on activities that are occurring within the city's limits. So such as transportation, energy use, production of waste. And it also includes those scope 2 emissions from electricity. The USCP protocol, it does not include emissions that are generated from goods that are produced outside of the city, even if they're consumed within the city. These are typically referred to as consumption-based inventories. The biggest reason for not including them is it's just really difficult to measure. We can use averages we can use nationally averaged values for that, but it doesn't, when you're using a national average, it doesn't provide you any mechanism to track or monitor change over time. There are several organizations working on trying to figure out methodologies for how to do this without spending a ton of time, but We're just not quite there yet. So when we're doing an inventory, how do we calculate those emissions? There's really two ways that emissions can be calculated. One is that you just measure them at the source of the production. That doesn't really make sense for a community inventory, though, where you have, we're creating emissions from our activities that might be generated all over the place. So we're not really going to the power plant and measuring how many metric tons of CO2 a year are being emitted. Instead, what we're doing is we're measuring what we call activities, things that we know contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and then we're applying what's called an emissions factor. So we know how much emissions is associated with a unit of electricity, a unit of waste, a unit of natural gas. And so we measure how much of that we're doing, apply the emissions factor, and that gets us to our emissions estimate. So there's a fair amount of data collection that goes in with doing these inventories. We have to track down all of the activity data. Some of it is easy to get, some of it is not, and then update the emissions factors associated with that. Greenhouse gas inventories are really important because they set the foundation for all of the other work and climate action planning that we do. We need them in order to forecast business as usual. We need them in order to figure out what actions we should take, because we have to know where our emissions are coming from. It allows us to measure progress over time, make informed decisions, and it also provides a mechanism for accountability to hold ourselves accountable to the work that we're doing and how it's tracking with our goals. It's also the first step of this 5-part circular process that ICLEI's created. They call it their 5 milestones for climate mitigation action. And number 1 is highlighted right here. It's not to say that we're only at step 1, but it's to say we're back at step 1, which is conducting an emissions inventory and developing our forecast. And then you use that. It's a constant state of kind of adaptive management and checking and refining as you move along. The greenhouse gas forecast is the thing that follows really naturally from an inventory. It's when you predict what emissions look like in the future if everything stayed the same. So we have a business as usual forecast that we're going to share that really just talks about what happens if the city doesn't take any action. If we already have some state policies, some federal policies, we also have population growth, so it really just brings all of those pieces into play. And then that's what you apply your reduction strategies to. So you say, how are emissions changing? Then what else can we do to go beyond that? So here is the final beautiful graphic, I guess, from the really long greenhouse gas inventory report. So there's 2 important graphics. So this is one of them. Our 2021 emissions, where do they come from? So our largest source of emissions in 2021 was from transportation. That makes up 34% of our emissions. And then the next 2 largest sources were commercial energy and residential energy. So that's really electricity and natural gas, the energy that we use to power and heat and cool and light our buildings. And so you might be more used to seeing in our regional plan, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, commercial energy and residential energy are bundled into one. So buildings end up being number 1. This is still saying the same thing. The data is just sliced and diced in a slightly different way. And then that's followed by some other things, upstream emissions, so those are the emissions associated with the production of energy, as well as some process and fugitive emissions as natural gas and things like that are transported. It leads to additional, it's kind of leaky, so we lose more emissions. So there's just additional emissions associated with transportation of fuels and that type of thing that's included here. You can see that kind of red-orange color. That is our solid waste, which makes up 3%, and then water and wastewater, which is less than 1%. So you can see that those kind of waste areas are really very small compared to the other sources of emissions. And so I have a couple of tables here, not to go through all of them in great detail right now, but in case you wanted to review later, they're in the slide deck. But for this one, the thing that I really just want to highlight is when you see it in the numbers, I think it also helps to show just how big residential and commercial energy and transportation are compared to some of the other sources that we have in our community. And this is the table that I'm not talking about. It just breaks it down much further. It is also in the report, but it's here for your reference if you want to. Sure.
I'm just curious, in water and wastewater, does that include the cost of moving water and wastewater around, the energy costs of the transportation?
Are the costs of moving water and wastewater, like pumps specifically and electricity, that's included within the commercial energy. And then the water and wastewater is just the, specifically the processing that's used for managing that. It can go in either place. That's just a decision we made on how to organize the data.
Can I ask a question, sort of to feed off, Jim and I were thinking the same thing. So the cost of running the lot water treatment plant, is that under commercial?
Yeah, that would be under commercial.
Okay, thank you.
Their electricity specifically. Yeah, okay. So this just breaks it down a little in more detail. It shows all of the different fuel sources and that we were looking at for each of these sectors of energy. And then we also have a contribution analysis. And so I'm just going to walk you through what this figure means a little bit because it's a little bit confusing at first. But then once you get what it's showing, I feel it's very clear. So the one thing that I'll flag is the y-axis, the one that goes up and down. It doesn't start at 0. It starts at 590,000 metric tons of CO2e. And then on the left here, it's showing the results from our 2019 inventory. And on the right here, it's showing the results from our 2021 inventory. And so what this is doing is showing the difference between 2019 and 2021. These red boxes and these blue boxes are showing things that increased and decreased in emissions between 2019 and 2021. And so this is the results of a contribution analysis, which what it does is it takes a very objective analysis of what changed between 2019 and 2021, and why did those things change? So if we saw less or more electricity use, was that because was it because we had more people? Was it because we had a hotter summer or a colder winter? So it looks at a lot of those different things and asks the why. And so what this does is it shows why our emissions are changing. So from 2019 to 2021, we did see about a 4.7 decrease in emissions. Is that a sustained reduction? I don't know, it's just 2 years. We need more years of monitoring.
I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
And it was during the pandemic where a lot of people weren't driving, a lot of offices were not operating, so.
Yes, you will see that highlighted in a second. Yeah, so is it a sustained reduction? Time will tell. There are a lot of things that changed during the pandemic that we know are already starting to bounce back. How much are they bouncing back? We don't know. So there's some things to be thought about there. So what this is showing is that even though our overall emissions decreased, we did see some increases in emissions from certain activities. Some of that can be contributed to a growth in population, and some of that can be contributed to hotter summers between 2019 and 2021. And then just some differences in waste and other types of things. And then the decreases in emissions, those were coming from decreased commercial kilowatt hours per job. I think this is a result of increased efficiency, but I need to check on this. Decreased VMT, so decreased vehicle miles traveled per person, and then changes in our electricity fuel mix. So our electricity being provided by Puget Sound Energy is getting cleaner and cleaner each year, and so this contributes to really significant decreases in our emissions. There's another table here that also goes into more detail that if you're curious, you can spend some more time looking at. It's also in the report and has just, it's more refined, less buckets, or more buckets, I guess. But here's the main points. What caused increases and what caused decreases? Growth contributors were population growth and hotter summers, leading to increased electricity consumption. Declines were related to electricity fuel mix, so our electricity getting cleaner, and decreased VMT. So We know that population is continuing to grow. We know that summers are likely continuing to get hotter. We know that our electricity fuel mix is going to continue to get cleaner. We don't know if VMT is going to continue to decline. In fact, we know that it's not. So this is just from 2019 to 2021. When we look at our more recent, at least not necessarily local data, but at federal, national trends, we saw kind of during the pandemic a huge decrease in vehicle miles traveled, and that's starting to tick back up again. It hasn't totally reached the pre-pandemic levels. What does that look like in Thurston County and Olympia? That will still be determined. So it's likely that some of these VMT-related emissions will come back up again as we update this for future years. And maybe should I pause in between these two sections?
Are there any additional questions, Councilmember Payne?
Yes, just one. Pamela, or Dr. Braff, how often will you monitor our emissions between now and 2030?
So 2019 was the first time that we had a city-specific inventory in recent history. We're trying to figure out what's the frequency moving forward. One of the things that ICLEI is doing is they're developing what they're calling their DASH protocol, which is a lighter lift effort for doing inventories in kind of in between years where you only look at your primary sources, your three largest sources of emissions. And so I'd like to look at doing that annually, a lighter, less intensive inventory, and then doing a full inventory like this maybe every 3 or so years in between.
Councilmember Parsley?
This might be too geeky, but I was wondering, with the natural gas, it's being equated to CO2 as opposed to methane, when methane is so much more detrimental.
Yeah, so what that means is when it'll just be a higher number because methane has higher potential.
So more CO2 equivalency. I
Yes.
got it, thank you.
Councilmember Cooper?
Thank you. So so I think that chart you just showed was really exciting, like in the reduction in tons, right? And so can you help us quantify that excitement and what that means? Because it looks way better than anything I've heard anyone say over the last few years. And maybe I'm just overreading the numbers.
Well, no, I mean, it is the first time since 2015, at the regional level, where we've been tracking this for longer, it is the first time since 2015 where we're actually seeing a reduction. So that is exciting. I would say cautious optimism. The VMT numbers, a lot of that is being driven by reductions in vehicle miles traveled. And so that's a watch kind of space. What we'd like to see, what we'll need to see is that start to really increase a lot more. When we start to see year after year reductions, and those reductions growing year after year, that's when I will be more optimistic.
Regarding vehicle miles traveled, oh, I can't talk today. How do you factor in EVs?
There's some discussion on this later. Right now, our electric vehicles make up such a small percentage of vehicles that it doesn't have a big impact on the total calculations. But it is something that we're going to need to figure out in our methodology. When I say we, I don't mean the city of Olympia. I mean partners like ICLEI who are developing methodologies for cities to do greenhouse gas inventories. They're working on how do we address the growing share of vehicles that are electric vehicles. Because right now our vehicle miles traveled are calculated based on just actual, or what we know about vehicles moving through the city. What we can do, though, is we can look at vehicle registration rates and that type of thing to know what types of vehicles people have, and then do some additional calculations there. But that then becomes harder for things like we have people that drive into and through in Olympia that are not Olympia residents, right? So, and where are they coming from? And so it creates, there are lots of questions and there are lots of uncertainties, and folks are working on how we address that.
Great, thank you. So maybe you could factor in like what the state percentage of EVs are and just average that in.
Yep.
Right, might be safer. Thank you.
Okay. I will move on to part 2 then. This is the exciting part, I think, the strategy analysis. So I'll start with our business as usual forecast. So as you all noted, reductions are starting to decline, and there are a couple of different reasons for that. One of them is the increasing renewable energy content of our electricity supply. And so in the business as usual forecast, this takes projected emissions resulted from estimated population growth, changes in federal automotive fuel standards, so vehicle fuel efficiency standards, as well as changes to the carbon intensity of our electricity grid based on Washington State's renewable energy standard for electricity supply. And what this does is it shows, just with those 3 things, emissions would decline from 2021 through 2050, and we see a 36% reduction by 2050. That could look great. 36%, that's much better than where we are today, but I do want to caution that is much lower than net zero. And that's also lower than the city's interim 2030 goal. So it's big, and we should acknowledge and celebrate that, and also know that there's much more to do to achieve the city's goals.
Pamela, could you just repeat, was that 36% from those sources?
Yes.
Thank you.
I pulled up this table here just to highlight a couple of things from the 2021 emissions to the 2030 business as usual, 2040 and 2050 business as usual. And so if you look at the residential and commercial, I just wanted to highlight that those are the areas where we're seeing the largest declines, and this is because of the increasing renewable energy. Our transportation and mobile sources, they kind of stay about the same. They increase before they start to decrease, and this is based on federal fuel efficiency standards. Solid waste increases due to growing population, and everything else kind of stays around the same. Our upstream impacts start to decrease because of those are emissions related to electricity production. So to take a look at strategies for achieving Olympia's goals, we were working with ICLEI's framework for science-based targets, and this focuses on a couple of different types of actions, actions that they call accelerating and supporting. So accelerating actions are the key steps to achieving the science-based targets, decarbonizing the electric grid, building electrification and efficiency, and EV transition and VMT reduction. And then we've got a whole bunch of other supporting policies, which are all our strategies, which are all really great things, and we should be supporting for a number of reasons, like nature-based solutions and a circular economy, but within the framework of the science-based targets, they don't achieve the highest reductions. And so you're not gonna see them showing up in the strategies, but that doesn't mean that they're not really very important as well. So the moderate reduction, there's a moderate reduction scenario and an aggressive reduction scenario. So in the moderate reduction scenario, we could achieve a 93% reduction in emissions by 2050. And then I just want to show the aggressive scenario for comparison. This is an 88% reduction in 2040. And so 93, it's a little bit less than what could be achieved in 2050, but it happens much faster. And so this is the one that's most closely aligned with Olympia's net zero by 2040 target. And we'll talk, I'll have a little bit later about kind of why it's not zero, or I guess 100% reduction, and how we can think about that a little bit more. And so this graph has a lot of things going on. This comes straight out of the ICLEI ClearPath software, which is a very powerful modeling tool. It doesn't necessarily have the best graphics. So I just want to explain a little bit about what you're seeing here. So there's a bunch of different lines. The very top line, the blue line, that's the business as usual forecast, the place where we started. There is a yellow dotted line, that's the next line right below that. That yellow line is the Regional Thirst and Climate Mitigation Plan 2030 goal. Below that is a green dotted line, which is the City of Olympia's 2030 science-based target. The blue dotted line below that is the TCMP, the Regional 2050 reduction goal. And then you can barely see it, but it's basically all the way at the bottom, which would be the City of Olympia's 2040 net zero reduction goal. So this is basically just saying this is what these amounts of reductions look like. And then behind that, you have what is the carbon wedge. And so it shows how emissions are changing in each of these different sectors: transportation, residential energy, upstream impacts, commercial energy, solid waste, water and wastewater. And so basically the takeaway here is that we can meet a lot of the goals through this aggressive reduction scenario. We're not quite meeting Olympia's net zero by 2040 target though. So this just talks about the emissions impact of some of the different actions. So we have emissions impact of moderate actions, and then I'm gonna show you a similar figure for the aggressive actions. And the point of this is just to kind of give you a sense of how these two different scenarios compare to each other. And so the areas that have the highest impacts are our renewable energy standard, building electrification, those are the really high ones. This is then followed by efficiency retrofits and VMT reduction. Both of those have moderate impacts. And then some of the lower impact actions are rooftop solar, upstream impacts, and landfill waste reduction. And when I say low, I don't mean no impact, just it's all relative, the things that are highest and the things that are lowest.
Does the rooftop solar become part of the fuel mix in the larger energy piece of the energy wedge?
It does. That's one of the, not in the way it's modeled here, but the reason why it's showing as zero is because it just becomes kind of negligible because our overall electricity is zero emissions. So adding more zero emissions energy to zero emissions energy does not reduce our emissions.
So then it really only helps the local building overall efficiency when you think about it that way.
Yeah, it helps. It's one of these things that's kind of similar to efficiency retrofits where their greatest value is not shown in their emissions reduction impact. It has a lot of benefits for helping to enable the renewable energy transition by reducing how much energy that our electricity producers need to provide. It means we're putting solar on rooftops rather than farmland and natural lands and things like that we're wanting to preserve. And it helps provide, depending on how it's developed, it can provide for resilience in the event of power outages, energy independence. So here's one of those ones where that zero looks like it's not maybe, oh, we don't need to do rooftop solar. That's not what that really means. It's just, it's another important strategy as a part of enabling the renewable energy transition. It just doesn't really doesn't show up well in the wedge.
And just as a comment to close that is, for me, that means we have to have really good reporting from our power company so we can understand that. Because like nobody's been able to tell us how many, even though in multiple rooms you're in, it's more than half of the people. So I think it's an important thing to keep trying to learn.
Councilmember Quinn.
Yeah, so just kind of following up to that, so would you call rooftop solars, I'm learning here, I think, rooftop solar, would that be a supporting action under a nature-based solution, or?
Depending on how you think about it. I wouldn't say rooftop solar on a building is a nature-based solution.
Okay.
We could talk about things like agrivoltaics, where they're intermixed with agriculture and things like that. Nature-based solutions generally refer to things like forest restoration that sequesters carbon, coastal restoration, that type of thing. So things that are really based in natural systems as opposed to the built environment. Estuary restoration.
Councilmember Parsley.
I guess maybe I'm 2 slides back, but when you're saying business as usual is 36% and aggressive and moderate, are you referring to reduction from 2021 or 2015?
When we talk about business as usual, we're talking about, that's the reduction from 2021. When we're talking about the emissions impact of the moderate actions and the emissions impact, or the moderate scenario and the aggressive scenario, it's a reduction from business as usual. So it's what business as usual in that year would be.
Okay.
Councilmember Payne.
So can you help me out here, because maybe I missed something? So if we're not going to meet net zero by 2040 under the aggressive model, what's that look like for the others? And what am I missing? What do we need to do to get there? Is it the vehicle miles traveled?
Can we come back to that question? I think we get there in this presentation. Yeah, there are ways to think about that. I guess what I'll say just very briefly right now is we maybe can't get there right now with what's available to us today.
You're asking us for something.
But there are other things, no, but there are other things that we can talk about and think about, and it also is very specific within these strategies, and so there's other strategies that we might talk about. So that we'll wrap up there.
Back to the question Councilmember Parsley had about I thought 2015 was kind of like our baseline year that we were going on.
2015 is the baseline year for the regional work. We don't have an Olympia-specific greenhouse gas inventory for 2015, so that's why this is to a different baseline
Got
year.
it, thank you.
Okay. So this is just showing some of the kind of range of actions, and then we have a similar table for the aggressive scenario actions. And the things that I just want to highlight is, in this scenario, rooftop solar has a bit more of an impact because our electricity supply won't be fully decarbonized by 2040. And then we also see a bigger impact of VMT reduction. And then a bigger impact on upstream impacts. So there's just kind of a little bit of variability depending on what actions go further. Just another way to think about the emissions impact, a big source of that is coming from the Washington Renewable Energy Standard. A big source of it is coming from increasing EV adoption, also reducing vehicle miles traveled. Building electrification is another important one, and then you can see efficiency retrofits. So just trying to give you an understanding of how these things fit together.
So I think what stands out to me is the landfill waste reduction has very little impact, and we're really working hard to help people understand, they need to reduce their waste and circular economy and all this, And I don't want people to think that it's not going to make a difference.
It's not that it doesn't make a difference. Yes, it made the chart, so it's big.
It's all relative.
It's just a smaller source of emissions, and we're going to go into, I'll show some examples of, this is a 50% reduction in upstream, or a 50% reduction in waste. If we had 100% reduction in waste, it could be even bigger.
Councilmember Parsley, followed by City Manager Burney.
Would this also potentially get at the thing that we cannot measure, which is us bringing stuff in? Because ultimately, it's a linear, it goes from Amazon to the landfill.
This is just what we are landfilling.
Yeah. Our consumerism, I guess, is where I'm going.
All right, City Manager Jay Burney, followed by Mayor Pro Tem Gilman.
Well, I was just going to add that on top of the greenhouse gas impacts of waste reduction, there's an environmental impact that's not captured here as well. So for our community that are watching at home, there's definitely an impact that they can make here on greenhouse gases, but there's also a pretty significant impact just on environmental pollution and other things that help us by reducing our waste, so.
Thank you for that. Mayor Pro Tem Gilman.
Thanks, Mayor Selby. First, on this conversation about rooftop photovoltaics or composting and not shipping waste away, I think each of those helps pave the way for a lifestyle that allows this. But in this conversation, we're talking pretty narrowly about these, the tons of carbon reduction. But I think that they are going to be super important parts of our actions and our conversation. Something that struck me, I was waiting for the aggressive slide to come to see if EV adoption was still part of that one, because this is baked in a huge assumption about single occupancy vehicles, rather than saying we go back to walking. And I'm just curious, because this would be a very different pie chart if we said we weren't going to have cars.
Yes, it would. So one of the reasons why this aggressive scenario is still in draft form is so that we can take some feedback from council. And so we can talk about if there are areas that you want to see increased or decreased as a part of that, and how that would change the scenario.
And if there's a point further on, we're going to address this, it'd be great. Otherwise, just, is this like the state of the art, this assuming that single occupancy EVs are going to dominate our transportation, or is that a decision that was made internally?
It's a combination of our understanding of what is likely to happen and just making our own best judgment on what we expect into the future, even within an aggressive scenario.
All right, Councilmember Cooper, followed by Councilmember Nguyen.
So my question might be actually from the first portion, but I'll ask it, and if you think it's better answered offline or later, that's fine. It came into mind when we were talking about the waste and kind of this concept of, where is it coming from? And so do we know what the new electricity fuel is? And is it hydroelectric? And if it is, what's the unintended consequence of switching to that and using more hydroelectric for the rest of the environment? Like to what Jay just said, that environmental balance where we know we need the dams out, but the wedge you just showed us, does it or does it not rely on more environmentally friendly power creation?
You speaking about the PSC's electricity? Yeah, it's the increase, well, I'll go back. Washington already has one of the cleanest electricity grids. That is because of a large reliance on hydropower. As utility providers are increasing their renewable energy, they are focusing primarily on wind and solar and other sources like that. And in fact, we also know that they're needing to make up for hydropower that's being lost, lost not in a negative way, but being not as much hydropower, whether it's due to closure of dams or also just when we have less snowpack and less rainfall and all of that, it reduces hydropower production as well. So all of that is considered as a part of the utility scale electricity planning.
I really appreciate that, because I think it's just like Clark's comment, like the trade-off of having cars or the trade-off of going towards more hydroelectric. So we have to understand that at least if we can't account for it. So thank you.
Councilmember Nguyen.
I'm sure you're going to cover this later on in your presentation. I was just really struck when you were saying that this chart is in draft, and council can influence it in some ways I'm guessing like what we're ready to commit to in future, right? Could you talk a little bit more about this being in draft form and exactly like, are there a set things of actions that would influence this? Because it's not just like whatever numbers we want to see on the chart, So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it is the numbers that influence what you see on this chart, which is the next thing that we're coming to. Yeah. So this chart, these numbers are based on the wedge analysis, which is based on a series of actions. And so for that, we based it on just kind of best practices, what best approaches for achieving science-based targets, that ICLEI framework. But even within there, there's space to decide how aggressive you want something to be. So we can't change everything, but it's the magnitude that can be changed, and then that influences the proportions of the pie chart. I will note that some things just won't budge. Like, they're just pretty stuck no matter what you do. But something like, for example, like we were talking about waste. There's a lot of benefits to reducing waste, but from a greenhouse gas reduction standpoint, they're just not they're not our largest source. So they're never gonna contribute to a greater reduction than building electrification, because it's just a much bigger source of emissions in the first place. So these next couple of slides, these are the things that go into the wedge analysis that influence the results. So these are the places where we have the ability to increase or decrease numbers. And so for each of these slides, I'm showing what's considered in the moderate scenario versus what's considered in the aggressive scenario. And then sometimes you'll see that they're exactly the same. So this is, in the case of electricity generation, they're very much the same. One is on the moderate scenario that the state achieves the 100% renewable energy standard by 2045, as is currently required by law, and then this really supports all of the EV adoption and heat pump adoption actions. And we see the same thing in the aggressive scenario. One difference with us is just that in the aggressive scenario, that's by 2040, and so 100% clean electricity wouldn't be achieved by then. If it were, that would create a 96% reduction in emissions. So you can go much further with that additional clean electricity if you had it before then. It'll also be achieved within the next 5 years on that time frame, because that's what's required by law. Under the moderate scenario, it has achieving 30% of technical potential for rooftop solar by 2050. And in the aggressive scenario, I'm sorry, that's a typo. That should be also 30% of technical potential for rooftop solar by 2040. So that's just more aggressive because that's the same amount, but faster. It's one of these things where this one shows up in the aggressive scenario a lot more because the grid's not fully decarbonized more, whereas in the moderate scenario where you already have a decarbonized electric grid, it's just not contributing really to a reduction in emissions.
Pamela, what does technical potential mean?
That looks at the area of rooftops within the city and taking up 30% of that.
Is that real or potential? So,
Oh, like rooftops that we already have?
yeah,
Yeah, I believe it's rooftops that are already available. So our rooftop acreage, square footage, whatever you would call it, is going to continue to grow.
okay, thank you.
Okay. The next one is building electrification. We've talked about building electrification a lot. This is really takes advantage of that renewable energy supply. In the moderate scenario, all buildings, 100% of buildings are all electric by 2050. And in the aggressive scenario, 100% of buildings are all electric by 2040. So how do you get there? Both scenarios start with, at some point in 2024 or 2028, 100% of all new construction being all electric. And then in the moderate scenario, it's 5% of buildings are electrified each year until 2050. And then in the aggressive scenario, it's 6.25% of existing buildings are electrified each year until 2040. And so this basically means every building in Olympia will be electrified and retrofitted by 2050 or 2040 in these scenarios. We see similar things for efficiency. 100% of buildings are receiving energy retrofits by 2050 or 2040, and then similarly those numbers of 5% per year or 6.25% per year. And the retrofits, this assumes energy savings of 20%, so that's significant. For new buildings, our current state energy code already achieves that 30% energy savings, so that piece is already check, it's done. The next step then becomes really focusing on the energy efficiency of existing buildings. This pairs really well with electrification, efficiency plus electrification at the same time. It reduces the amount of electricity you need, which then also supports grid decarbonization. So all of these strategies are supportive. For vehicle miles traveled, for the moderate scenario, we included beginning in 2024, on-road gasoline VMT is reduced 10% by 2030, and then another 10% from 2030 to 2050. So why the big jump between 2030 and then slower from 2030 to 2050? That's to be aligned with our science-based target. To achieve that 2030 goal, really need to front load a lot of that VMT reduction work. And then we just break it down into some numbers of how many miles of VMT reduction that equates to. And then in the aggressive scenario, this is a 20% reduction in VMT by 2040. So for example, this is one of the things that could be increased. 20% is pretty aggressive. Vehicle behavior is probably one of the most inflexible things about our society, and so that's I'll just leave that there. And then we have EV adoption, and so in the moderate scenario, this means 98.76, so almost 100% of all vehicles in Olympia are electric by 2050, and then in the aggressive scenario, this is 100%, so all vehicles by 2040. This so breaks it down into some more specific numbers, and then it also means adopting electric vehicles or hydrogen-powered vehicles for transit diesel vehicles as well in both scenarios. The moderate scenario, these numbers are what would be achieved based on federal or national level fleet turnover rates. So we looked at how quickly do people typically replace their vehicles, and then we also looked at the Washington state vehicle sales requirements and registration requirements. And so the moderate scenario, it's not quite business as usual because there's a lot of things that influence that type of behavior, but that's if we're continuing to support EV adoption, the statewide EV purchasing requirements are going to help get us there. The aggressive scenario means we would have to just get to that same 100% number 10 years sooner. The waste scenario, this is the same for the moderate and aggressive. It is a reduction in solid waste of 50% by 2050 or a reduction in solid waste of 50% by 2040. Under both scenarios, upstream impacts are just going to be reduced over time as we clean up our electricity grid. It just happens kind of at different times. And so that just, we don't really need to do anything except support the transition to renewable energy. One thing that I really want to emphasize here with all of these strategies is this is nothing new. All of these are already addressed in our regional climate mitigation plan. We've already spent a lot of time with the community working to develop strategies and a framework for reducing regional greenhouse gas emissions. What this does do is it gives us a sense of scale and magnitude. It talks about how much and how fast that Olympia would need to take these same actions that are already in our regional plan in order to achieve the Olympia-specific climate goals. So, achieving net zero by 2040 or 2050, very clearly the numbers I showed you today are not net zero, so I just want to acknowledge that and talk about that for a moment. First up, I also want to emphasize the importance of not just focusing on the 2040 or 2050 goal and also thinking about our interim targets, 2030, which is much sooner and also really important. Achieving those interim targets are what set us up for success for those long-term targets having the impact they're intended to have. Because we start to just kind of, the more emissions that we put out, the more they concentrate in our atmosphere, the longer they stick around. And so having some immediate sustained reductions has really significant long-term impacts. So our 2030 target, I'm not showing this here, but our 2030 target is feasible through all of these pathways with existing strategies and technologies. So what we've modeled in ClearPath gets us to, in both scenarios, it gets us to that 2030 target if we implement all of the actions. Further action, though, would be needed to achieve a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 or 2050. And so this could include a lot of different things. This could include new technology that's not yet developed or widely available or at scale. So we think about this a lot with heavy-duty vehicles that are not easily electrified yet. That technology is going to be developing and evolving and becoming more widely available, but we didn't make assumptions that that would be available 100% in these scenarios because it's just not yet. Another one is thinking about our carbon sinks and carbon sequestration. So things like estuary restoration, forest restoration, prairie restoration, shoreline restoration, all of that supports carbon sequestration, which can help offset emissions. The other one is purchasing local, credible, renewable energy credits or carbon offsets, which provide additionality. And so additionality basically just means that purchasing credits for activities that would not have occurred were that incentive or that money not available in the first place. And that sounds great, but it is really difficult to prove in practice, and it's really difficult to monitor. So anything like that really needs to be approached with caution. It's the same thing with carbon sequestration. It needs to be additional carbon sequestration that would not have occurred without additional intervention in order to include it as a part of a net zero strategy. And so those are all possible solutions that can help kind of close the gap between what we're showing right now for 2040 and 2050 and what would be net zero in 2040 and 2050. So our next steps here is we need to finalize the emissions reduction scenario for Olympia. And this is going to be really helpful for a couple of reasons. It helps us create some performance metrics to really start tracking at a more granular level. Where are we going, what needs to be changed? It's also going to help with our comprehensive plan updates. There's now a requirement to include a climate mitigation and climate resilience element within our comp plan. The goals and policies or the final emissions reduction scenario can help inform the goals and policies that are then included within Olympia's climate element within the comprehensive plan. And so this just puts us a lot closer to being able to do that work. And then we would adopt those greenhouse gas reduction measures into the comprehensive plan. And then I know there's been a lot of questions about what does it cost to do all of this work. And so now we have numbers, number of vehicles per year, number of buildings per year. And so we can then use that as the basis to do some estimation of costs for what it takes to implement this work. And that's it.
Wow, well, thank you very much. I know we had budgeted 45 minutes with questions, and you could just see how excited we all are about finally getting this information. It's been something that, these concepts seem really kind of vague and ethereal until you can really, really dial in on what we can do. So thank you, and thanks to ICLEI and your relationship that you've developed with them that's allowed us to get this kind of information at our level. Councilmember Cooper.
Thank you. Sorry, I have a question. I know you're trying to move on, so I'll be quick. So in your presentation, you had the Puget Sound Energy needing to get to 100% clean energy by 2040, 5 years early in the moderate and aggressive. And in your report, it's in the additional actions section. And so can you just talk about that a little bit? And is there ever been a jurisdiction in the world that's negotiated better than the state outcome for a power energy mix?
Has there ever been? I don't know. So in the moderate scenario, I don't know if I had it wrong there. In the moderate scenario, it's PSE doing what they're doing under state law, achieving zero emissions energy by 2045. In the aggressive scenario, that we showed with the 88% reduction, it's the same thing by 2045. If they were to achieve it, or we were to achieve it sooner, by 2040, that would be a 96% reduction in 2040.
Okay, that makes sense, because it just wasn't on your additional step slide. And so I wanted to make sure
Yep.
that, so that's still a very real scenario, that if we could somehow negotiate or generate our own clean electricity, then we would be able to get there 5 years earlier.
Councilmember Parsley.
So I'm looking at the carbon sequestration technology. I'm more wondering if the role of a city in urban is densifying and helping the county keep their carbon sinks and their sequestration work, because they own most of the trees, except for the estuary, of course, and most of the carbon sinks. Am I wrong? Is us focusing on densifying, getting people out of their cars, getting EV vehicles, and encouraging others to do the carbon sequestration work?
Yeah, we didn't include landscape emissions or reductions in the scenario, and that was very intentional because the goal is to focus on reducing emissions first. In a science-based target, or when you're setting a net zero goal, you're supposed to reduce emissions as much as possible before you make up the rest with carbon sequestration, whether that be biological carbon sequestration or geological carbon sequestration through carbon capture technology, whatever that is. So when we talk about carbon sequestration, yeah, I think it's important to recognize we have limited forest land within urban areas, and we have a lot of forest land and other natural, rural areas in other parts of our region and out in the county. And so thinking about carbon sequestration as an integrated regional strategy is really important.
Food and restaurants in neighborhoods.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Payne.
Thank you, I'll be quick, I promise. So are you telling us that we'll need to adopt a policy on existing buildings next year? Because I've been trying to read between the lines here.
Policy or a program or a significant source of funding, or all of the above, really, in order to meet those targets.
And hopefully there's grants out there at the federal level that will come our way, because we're really good at writing grant applications. So, all right, thank you very much. It's a lot of work. And we're going to move on now to item 2B, which is a discussion around a potential annexation in our southeast quadrant of the city. And so I'm inviting forward Tim Smith, who's our Deputy Director in Community Planning and Development, and he'll be presenting along with Aaron B. Miller, who is our Finance Director. Let's switch our name tags.
All right, good evening. Tim Smith, Deputy Director for Community Planning and Development, here to talk about annexation. And like Dr. Braff, it's been a while since I've been to a study session, so it's great to be here. It's great to talk about annexation. I don't think we've had an annexation discussion with the full council since the last petition, which was the Suki Nursery, kitty corner from the Briggs YMCA in 2016. So it's great to be here to talk about annexation. It's certainly a ripe topic to be talking about. The city's been studying this southeast area urban growth area annexation for about 5 years, so it's good to be here at this point. So I'm here this evening with Aaron B. Miller. It's a shared PowerPoint presentation. He has some slides inserted where he'll be talking about the financial side of the annexation. I also want to recognize some other staff in the room. We have Chief Todd Carson, Assistant Chief Mike Buchanan, and also Mark King, who's the Fire Chief of the East Olympia Fire District here as well. So, and then Leonard Bauer and Jay will be also making comments probably as we move along. It's been a true staff effort across the board. So what we're going to talk about tonight is do a little background on annexation, why we annex, what are urban growth areas, We'll talk a little bit about the annexation report, primarily the 2023 report that was done by Echo Northwest, which was really a building upon the work that was done by a consultant back in 2019. So you have two reports in your packet. And the 2019 report has a lot of good baseline information, but certainly the Echo Northwest report goes a bit further in looking at impacts to the general fund over time. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on for this presentation. And then we'll have Aaron give some information on the financial consideration, especially the sales and use tax provision that was added in statute that allows the city to take advantage of through a certain annexation method. And then we'll follow up with the staff recommendation and what next steps would be if council supports that recommendation. So first we'll talk about annexation. So annexation is simply put the expansion of incorporated boundary of a city. Annexation is limited to areas within an urban growth area. And this is a big thing to highlight. Starting in 1990, that became the rule with the adoption of the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act required that the cities plan for future growth with the county and plan for how to accommodate 20 years population growth. Prior to 1990, it was pretty much a free-for-all for annexation. Cities would grab as they wanted, often competing with each other. So they created boundary review boards to help oversee that process. That process has continued with the BRB, as we call it, but primarily now the annexation area is guided by that urban growth area as the framework. Again, UGA is sized to accommodate our projected population growth. That's updated through our comprehensive planning process every 8 years, working with the county on sizing those UGAs to establish areas for the 20-year growth projection for the entire county. The focus with the urban growth areas of the cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Yelm. And once you establish those UGAs, they have to develop at urban densities and be served by urban services. And so this is an important component back in the 90s when we established these UGAs. How are they going to develop? Cities had a couple of choices. They could have worked with the county to develop kind of land reserve areas to have real low density zoning. So that would basically wait until a city annexed to start development. But the county and the cities chose to do a different approach where the counties agreed to adopt joint plans and city zoning for the urban growth areas. And so if you're a city planner or a county planner working for the county, you're implementing 5 zoning codes: Yelm, Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and the county. And so that's important to keep in mind as development occurs, the expectation is that they apply our development standards to that area. So why consider annexation? Well, as I mentioned, UGAs established the framework for future annexation. So really back in 1992 to 94, when we developed our first comprehensive plan, we identified those urban growth areas where we would advance and grow in the future. Because of that, the city has started to invest and maintain infrastructure in that area. Certainly you can see with our parks acquisitions and parks planning with the former Spooner Farms and other parklands, but also with our water and sewer infrastructure. As growth happens out there, developers are extending our water and sewer lines, and then the city is maintaining those water and sewer lines. And so we've had substantial investment really into that area over the last 30 years. When you look at some maps of the water lines and the sewer lines throughout the area. Certain city revenues would increase. Certainly there's the impact to the general fund we'll talk about, but there's other revenue sources such as the Transportation Benefit District, the Metropolitan Park District, where revenues would substantially increase with those community members paying into those funds. The city would start collecting impact fees for new development. Right now we have to rely on SEPA. So if there's a project in the UGA, the county can approach the city and we can request SEPA mitigation fees. The problem with that is that a lot of developments exempt from SEPA. Certainly single-family homes and other smaller projects, commercial included, are exempt from SEPA, so we're not collecting impact fees. And so we're seeing impacts to our transportation system without impact fees to help offset those costs. Annexation would ensure new development meets current city standards. I mentioned at the beginning that the county adopted our zoning back in the 90s. Those codes haven't been updated since 1998. And so if you think about all the changes to our zoning that's occurred even the last few years with housing options, missing middle, our minimum parking standards, design review standards, sign standards, but then go back 25 years before that, none of those are reflected in the current standards the county is applying to development in that area. The county has said they will start a program to start updating their codes once they get done with our joint plan process, but it's really never been a priority. They have a lot of competing priorities for their staff and it's simply not getting done. That's not unique to Olympia. Tumwater and Lacey are in the same boat with that. And then lastly, cities can offer programs and services to community members in the UGA. An example is Energize Olympia. I mean, Dr. Braff gets phone calls all the time about the heat pump program from community members that live out in Boulevard Road outside of the county and Yelm Highway. They're not eligible. And that's just one example of many programs the city would offer to urban, as an urban service provider that the counties simply aren't designed to offer. So with that, there's a couple different petition or methods of annexation we can talk about. The most common is the petition method of annexation. And this is when you have property owners representing 60% of an assessed value of an area can approach the city and sign a petition, start an annexation process. In Olympia's case, as well as other cities, when you have properties develop in the UGA and we extend water and sewer, they sign basically an annexation agreement form. That gets recorded and that becomes a document the city can use to sign a petition for that property owner. And so currently the annexation area of the Southeast UGA, we do have in excess of 60% in petitions that the city, in annexation agreements that the city would sign. So the petition method is available for use for this process. City council hearing is required and then it goes to the Thurston County Boundary Review Board for review and approval. And so it's a fairly long process, but it's certainly a process that cities have used. There's an alternative annexation method that staff really wasn't looking into until recently when we heard of a change in statute for the interlocal agreement method of annexation. And this is an interlocal agreement that's jointly approved agreement with Thurston County. It may also include special districts. So example, fire districts that are impacted could take part in this agreement where you can address their loss of revenues, how you transfer services, transfer assets, and then take over service over time. This is city and counties required to hold public hearings. And then I have on there BRB review is required. However, we're looking into that. It may be where this process is exempt from BRB review. And so we'll be working with our legal department to confirm that. But our guidance from MRSC so far is that it may be exempt from BRB review if we do this form of annexation. Probably most importantly, the reason we are looking at this alternative is because it makes the city eligible for a sales and use tax credit. And that's something we'll get into a little bit more here that Aaron has some numbers on to show how that impacts moving forward into the general fund and what some advantage of using that approach is. An annexation of this process is not subject to referendum, meaning that if community members out there disagree with the annexation, they can't sign a petition and take it to a vote. Once the ordinance is approved by council after a hearing, the annexation is complete. And so there is not a referendum process that you see in other forms of annexations. So where are the UGAs? So this is a map that shows the three cities. They're incorporated areas in yellow, and then you can see the unincorporated urban growth areas in gray. I think is this the word? So the annexation area we're looking at is the southeast area here, which is about 2.5 square miles. As you can see, the city has other areas of urban growth area to the northwest and northeast. Likewise, with Tumwater, they have a little bit left along Black Lake, and then Lacey has quite a large area of urban growth area that's not currently annexed.
Sorry, Tim, Councilmember Cooper?
Can you just clarify if it includes the little wedge to the right in the southeast, or is that the Lacey
that's
UGA,
Lacey.
the square box? Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
that's Lacey, yeah. And so this map shows annexations that have occurred since 2005. Sorry, I'm in your way. So you can see that the city of Tumwater has been very active with their annexations. Interesting to note the area here to the southeast is also an area that impacted Fire District 6, and so they worked out an interlocal agreement that we can talk about later that helped transition service to that area with reducing the impacts to Fire District 6. And then Olympia has done some annexations, some smaller ones in the last few years, mainly to deal with unincorporated islands, areas that are surrounded by the city. So this particular area shown in purple is currently an area of, like I said, about 2.5 square miles. In 2022, had a population of almost 8,000. They expect by 2045, TRPC projections that it'll grow to 8,900 in population. Likewise for housing, 2022 is at 3150, and it'll grow a little bit, about 700 to 3810. So the timeline for evaluating this annexation, like I said, we've been looking at it for about 5 years. In 2018, the Land Use Environment Committee directed staff to do a feasibility study in which they hired a consultant firm to do that. The report was prepared in 2019. It provided a great profile of the area and some high-level analysis of the potential annexation in phases. At the time, we were looking at whether to divide it into phase 1, phase 2, basically north of Yelm Highway, south of Yelm Highway. The report concluded that doing it all at once made a lot of sense because a lot of effort would need to go through it, and a lot of the impacts were kind of the same. But what that report didn't provide was kind of a breakout of costs over time, specific to the general fund. And so when we went back to the Land Use Committee, they wanted more analysis. We hired Echo Northwest to complete the study that was finished in 2023. It's important to note that when this study was finalized and presented to the Finance Committee in May 2023, the sales and use tax provision was not in law yet. So that report does not talk about that as a potential option. And so that's why we're putting a lot more information to you now with Aaron's team to talk about that. So just to go through some brief notes on the 2023 study, growth assumptions, they used the TRPC projections for growth in the area. They looked at net revenues and costs with a focus on major tax streams and service costs with a summary of ongoing revenues and costs, also acknowledging one-time costs. And one of the big ones in there you'll see is the required new fire station that we've determined is necessary in order to serve land south of Yelm Highway. And so that's factored into and addressed. But looking at general fund impacts particularly, and those impacts are primarily fire, police, and public works specific to transportation and road maintenance. Looked at two scenarios, one with an RFA, one without. Obviously, we know that we're now under scenario 1. And so a lot of information in the report you can ignore. It's only, you see only that pertains to the outcome of the election. There's a chart in there that talks about revenue impacts, and this is a chart I wanted to include just to show, yes, there's general fund impacts. This is over a 20-year cumulative period, and so we have other information that shows how it is impacted over time. This also assumes no additional revenue streams, and so just take that into consideration. But it shows a net cost for the general fund of about $90 million. But then it talks about some of the revenues that we gain, and those are the things I mentioned a few moments ago, with the Metropolitan Park District, the Transportation Benefit District revenues, a real estate excise tax revenues. And so you can see, and then we also threw in there the capital cost of the fire station, recognizing in the footnote that we didn't address any offsetting revenues for that, such as a voter-approved bond. But the overall net cost is about $68 million. And looking at the specific services of the area for the Olympia Fire Department, you factored in that service would be provided by the fire department north of Yelm Highway upon annexation. South of Yelm Highway, Fire District 6 we'd contract with them to provide service until 2028. And then a new engine company would come on in 2029 with a new station built. That is just a date we came up with for the report. That could be pushed out as far as we want. But that's just for the sake of the report, we came up with a timeline for this. In looking at the fire districts over here, you can see here's Yelm Highway that runs down like this. And so you can see that the annexation area, which is all this area here, the area in kind of pink is Fire District 3 Lacey, and then Fire District 6 is the green. It looks like Lacey is quite impacted, but compared to its overall service area, it's about a 5% impact to its revenue. Fire District 6 is different. For them, it's a pretty significant impact of about 20 to 25% of their revenue. And most of their focus is south of Yelm Highway. And so they did approach the city in 2018 and said, if you do annexation, we'd appreciate if you do it in phases. North of Yelm Highway first and then come in south. So that's certainly one option, but we could also address phasing through an interlocal agreement about when services are provided by the city and it's taken over and which are provided by the district. So we can certainly honor that request through the ILA process. Olympia Police Department, in working with the police chief and their officers, we determined that 6 new officers would be needed for a new patrol area, training and equipment. That would be phased over 2 years. 3 police would be hired in year 1, 3 in year 2, with a gap in service that would be covered would be with overtime pay. And so that's what was factored into the report for 2023. For public roads and maintenance, we needed 2 additional staff members in traffic and street operations. Needed to keep the staff per lane mile at baseline levels, and then the chart below shows staff costs in addition to signs, street lights, and street surfaces and right-of-way maintenance, for a total cost of about $547,000. Stormwater is one of the utilities we'll talk about. Just keep in mind, it's not a real impact to the general fund, but to the utility itself. And so we have stormwater. We would assume all maintenance operations of the existing stormwater facilities within this urban growth area. There'd be upfront costs for a new construction truck and trailer, and ongoing costs, 2024 would be $642,000, 2 additional staff, and then ongoing user fee revenues would be $680,000. And the report recognizes that, fees can be adjusted over time to account for any deficiencies for this particular utility. Same can be made with waste resources, solid waste. The important thing to note here is that under state law, the city can't take over solid waste service for 10 years after annexation. And so there is that timeline to allow the city to gear up with some upfront capital costs and then address the ongoing costs with ongoing user fee revenues about $1.5 million. Services assuming no impact, one is water and sewer. The city already provides those services to the southeast urban growth area. We do have some existing private water systems and septic systems throughout. There is a 50% utility bill surcharge that's currently applied to properties where they haven't signed an annexation agreement. That would go away, and that's a small cost to the city. And then parks, there's no operational impact. Yeah. There are some positive gains for that. And so the general fund impacts over time. So this is the chart that shows in green the revenues and then the expenses in purple. And the big bump in 2029 is when we take over fire service for this area south of Yelm Highway with a new fire station. So you can see the deficit to the general fund starts off in 2025 at about $590,000, and then it grows from there. That brings us to the...
Hey, Tim, can you go back one?
Sure.
I know you're going to cover the sales and use, but I just want to point out something that Tim pointed out earlier. When it comes to the new fire station, the assumption is that we're cash funding a fire station in 2029. It doesn't assume a bonded measure or another way to pay for it. So that spike that you see in 2029 and goes outward, there's a lot of choice points that the council could make over time that can shrink that in terms of a new fire station. So I just want to point that out. This is a pretty conservative look at what this could look like with a new fire station. And as Tim pointed out, when we choose to build that station is also within our control. In terms of when that happens. If we may want it sooner, we may choose for a lot of reasons to do it later, but there's some flexibility there. So I just want to make sure that point's really clear when it comes to a fire station.
So an option for addressing the general fund impacts. That brings us to House Bill 1425, sales and use tax provision using the ILA method of annexation. And what this does is it credits on current sales tax rate of 6.5%. It shifts the maximum of 0.1% of sales and tax revenue collections from the state to the city. Aaron-Seam estimates that 2023 sales tax collections for 0.1 is about $3.1 million. That would be per year for 10 years. What this credit does is it fills the gap between revenues and expenses for several years and provides timelines for the city to look at other revenue streams. So basically, it helps us cover this gap of about 10 years where we see the costs going up. Caveats to using this revenue, it has to be used within the annexation area. There's a 10-year duration period, so there's a limit on how long we can use this money. And then the effective date is July 1st following the year of annexation. So if an annexation were to be completed at, say, the end of next year, then it would be July 1st of 2025 where that money can become available. That brings us to Aaron.
Do you want to take any questions before we switch lanes here? Or is there anyone, Mayor Pro Tem Gilman?
Tim, I'm thinking about our 2018 and 2019 conversations where there was a pretty good list of what we thought was deficient infrastructure in some of those areas of street lighting, curb and sidewalk, intersections, road width, and that's something that I was just hoping to get a picture of are those still issues, and how would we schedule or phase the promises of bringing those neighborhoods up to our city standards?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also, I think that's citywide, current city limits. We have a lot of deficient city roads and sidewalks, and so the answer to that, and I talked to Mark Russell this morning a little bit, Public Works Director, and he pointed out that in 2027, we'll be looking to update our transportation master plan, and at that point, we could reprioritize based upon if this annexation went through projects within that area with the existing city limits. So they would have to compete for the same pool of money, or that money may grow given other revenue streams that we could gain. But there are deficiencies out there. I mean, if you look, within the Wilderness subdivision or any areas out there, there are a lot of deficient areas, and we recognize that. We did not do an inventory for this project, but we just know that any deficiencies we bring in would have to compete for the money with the rest of the city.
I got a question, might be for Aaron, both of you. So that $3.1 million figure you used for the 1/10 of 1% sales tax, that is currently what we collect. That's within our city limits now. So if we expand and, no?
So the 1/10 of 1% sales tax credit, the state gets 6.5% of the sales tax that's collected. The state would then give up 0.1%, so they would get 6.4%, and then we would get that 0.1% sales tax shifted over to us for 10 years.
Got it. But like the Inspire Olympia Fund, for example, is 0.1% and we're going to get about $3 million. So when we expand this boundary to include the southeast, residents, won't our sales tax collections go up?
Yeah, slightly, and
I see
the,
more Amazon trucks in southeast.
and the model that the consultant put together for us included some of that revenue from sales tax increase there.
So Aaron, can I just add to that? I think the reason we're saying slightly as compared to other parts of the city is it's a lot of residential in the southeast, and so there's not a lot of not a lot of businesses in the southeast that would generate sales tax. So we're really relying on, as you said, the Amazon and those purchases, which I think is probably harder for the consultant to estimate at this point in time. So again, I think their numbers are probably conservative when it comes to that, because it's really hard for them to give a good estimate there.
Yeah.
So I think it's a valid point.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Aaron B. Miller with the Finance Department. Relatively timely here. I've been asked to put together some financial information, and with the budget process kicking off with our Finance Committee tomorrow, and then the council meeting next week, we'll get kind of a little preview of where we're heading. So I just want to talk about a couple of the assumptions that we have going into this. We began a couple of years ago creating 10-year general fund forecasts as well as our utility fund forecasts. We do those usually after the most recent year ends. So normally around March, April of 2024, we'd put together our new 10-year forecast using the most up-to-date numbers we have from 2023. The numbers that we put together here are really using 2023 and ratcheting that forward. So I just wanted to make sure that we're starting really with the 2023 assumptions that have not been updated from them. So there's that. As most of our forecasts do, we assume no new revenues, and that is nothing new. We have growth in revenues, but nothing new coming into the city. And we also assume no new FTE. We know that's wrong. And so the first thing I always say when we talk about forecasts, the answer is wrong. What we have on paper is wrong. We do the best that we can to project out to the future, and it gives us at least a tool to make our business decisions using. When we talk about the annexation area, we are talking general fund specific in the charts that we have. So it doesn't include utilities and all that. It's all just an impact to the general fund. the assumptions we're using for the annexation are based on the consultant analysis. And we are assuming that we can fully collect the 0.1% sales tax credit for 10 years. And the reason that we're assuming that we can, as Tim mentioned earlier, it's not free money. In order for us to get that benefit, we have to show the state that we've used $3.1 million of citywide funding in that annexation area. So to the extent that we bring in a whole bunch of new things for this, that will have an impact, and we'll talk about that as we go through the slides. And then, excuse me, as we talk about our forecasts, we are putting in, just for your information, a levy lid lift of $1. About a dime is roughly $1 million. So a $1 lid lift would be about $10 million. We're adding that in because as we talk through this, whether or not the annexation goes through, in order to continue to fund just our current ongoing operations, we're going to need an infusion of resources. And that's part of that. So we wanted to show that even as we talk about the annexation piece, there's the bigger picture to the general fund in total, and how that kind of marries into the annexation conversation. We'll walk through that. So just to talk through a couple of high-level forecast assumptions to remind you, on the revenue side, we assume property tax at 2.5% growth. That's the 1% that we get growth based on the state limitations, plus new construction, any refunds, as well as state shared utilities. We are assuming sales and use tax at a 4.5% increase in the out years, B&O, private and public utilities at 2%, and then the other revenues, whether they be fines and forfeitures, miscellaneous revenues, licenses and permits, they're anywhere between the 2 and 3.5%. And then our expense drivers, salary increases 3.5%, benefits 6%, and supplies and services 3%. And I just wanted to take a pause here because when we put our forecast together, we use the most recent 5-year numbers. We throw out any known outliers, and then we roll that up to a percentage change over time. So 3.5%, just using the salary adjustment as an example, over the last 3 years, we've increased salaries, I think, 13%. So this isn't really necessarily that conservative. It's not really that liberal either. I mean, but so we try to do the best. So, we can always talk about, should we have included this or should we have left this out or that? But, and again, this is just a tool to try to get us to be able to have a business conversation about what the future looks like it may be bringing. So, mentioned we were going to talk about the levy lid lift. This is something that I know that you have all seen before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But when we talk about a levy lid lift, at least at this point in time, we're talking about a single year lift, which would be the third bar that you see there. It takes place in the future, and then what happens is all the 1% increases from that point forward start at that new base level. It does take a simple majority vote, and that funding can be used for any good governmental purpose. So it can come into the general fund and we can use it for any good purpose there. So you've seen this before. Now this, normally we do a 10-year forecast. This is obviously a little bit longer. There's a reason for that. We wanted to be consistent as we show this throughout. So this goes out through 2036. And you can see the red expense or the orange expense increasing at a rate that is faster than the revenues. We've put the surplus gap down on the bottom just so you can see by year kind of where that gap is going. And really what we see in our forecast is that revenues increase at about 3.5% per year and expenditures at 4.1. So we're constantly having to make that gap up. When you look at the 24 to 25, you can see that it dips down on the revenue side. And that's something that we will be talking about. We are using fund balance to close 2024 budget. And so the 2025, we take that fund balance use out to kind of reset. And so that's why you see that change there. But again, as you see over time, our expenses are increasing at a rate faster than our revenues. This is a picture of the same information, except we've also included a levy lid lift of $1 in this, and we're assuming the levy lid lift, in this case, in 2025. We had to give a year that we began it, and so we just thought we'd put it there. This still assumes no new other revenues, so it's an increase in property tax, but no new other revenues, and no new FTE, no new programs. So again, we know that that's wrong. But even with that, a $1, $10 million influx of property tax over time starts to erode, and somewhere between 2034 and 2035, we would cross back over where that $1 levy lid lift and those resources don't support ongoing operations. To the extent that in hypothetically 2028, 2029, where we have this excess, I shouldn't say excess, when we have more revenue than we do expenditures. If we add things there that aren't revenue backed, it just shrinks that timeline before we make that crossover. So the timeline becomes, comes a little bit closer. So I just wanted to make that point as we look at this, that over 10 years, it starts to erode and crosses back over. So the annexation area. So I want to spend just a little bit of time with this. You can see that the expenses are still in red and the revenues are in blue. Let's first start at the 2024 to 2025 in revenues, and then the 2025 to 2026. That's the influx of the state sales tax credit. It starts in July of 2025, so we're showing a 6-month impact there, and then in 2026 you get the full year as it continues on. And then that starts way out there in 2035. That first dip in the blue, which is the revenues, is because it ends at the end of June, and then 2036, that shows none of that sales tax credit revenue. So as we go through this, you can see the big spike, and this is something that Jay mentioned earlier. Right now, the consultant study and what we're using is the building of a fire station in 2029. We've continued that here. That can, as was talked about, can shift out. We are assuming that we will bond for that. And so that's why the spike in the blue line, that we would go out, we'd borrow $21 million to pay for the construction. And then moving forward, we have about $1.5 million in debt service accounted for. And so we're using a 20-year debt service of about $1.5 million. So that's what the main reason that the line kind of comes together in 2031 and 2030. It's because that debt service carves into that. So this is where we talked a little bit about that 3.1. We have to spend the money in order to receive the 3.1 million. So what we're showing here in 2025, 26, 27, we're showing the full impact of the 0.1% sales tax. On the expenditure side, we're only showing at this point what's in the consultant study. So it doesn't include things like if we contract with the fire district out in the annexation area. Extra costs for PD outside of the positions and the overtime they have, if there's additional overtime. So all of those things, we're gonna have to monitor, we're gonna have to be able to come up with a way to account for and be able to provide to the state in order to get that money. So if this ends up going forward, that's one of the things that we'll start next is how do we parcel this out? How do we believe it won't be a problem to spend the money. We just then have to come through and make sure that we are accounting for it and we kind of have all of our ducks in a row. So this picture here is a little bit, it assumes, I shouldn't say it's a little bit, this picture assumes a shift of some of those current operations out to the annexation area that may have taken place somewhere else previously. So what we've done here is we've done an overlay, and the solid lines are the general fund forecast that we talked about, and then the dotted lines, the hashed lines, those are the general fund forecast plus the annexation forecast that we put together just from the last slide. And you can see that when we include the annexation monies in there, it narrows the gap for a while. You can see that using 2026 as an example, the general fund forecast shows about a $7.2 million variance, and then, but when we combine the annexation, it drops down to about $3 million. So it does show that. Now, again, that assumes a shift of some activities that would go to the annexation area. What ends up happening, though, as we go out into the future around 2035, that's where the 0.1% sales tax credit goes, and that's where it really starts to open up that gap there, because we still have in the dotted expenditure line for the combined, we still have all of the operations from fire, from police, we have the $1.5 million debt service and all of those things. So that's the main reason we really wanted to show this out to at least 2036, is because you can kind of get to see the future years of that. Up front, that does also give us time to look at different potential options, but in the upfront, it doesn't exasperate the general fund forecast that we have. So this is the same view, except we have included the $1 levy lid lift for both the general fund as the regular levy, as well as the annexation area. In the annexation area, the dollar lid lift doesn't do a whole lot out there because of it's just got a lower assessed value, and so the impact of $1 on that assessed value, it still is more, but it's just not as significant. So you see in this view, as well as in the previous one, a dollar lid lift, puts the revenues in a positive positions over expenditures for a while. But again, back out there in 2035, assuming no new revenues, assuming no new FTE, assuming all of those things, it does cross back over. And so it basically gives us the same story again as we saw in the general fund. This is a different picture of what we showed a couple of slides back for the general fund and annexation area. We would just want to demonstrate the impact of the annexation area, that it changes from 7.2 million in 2026, then we have a 4.2 million positive variance, and then that changes it to 3. So it just gives a different dynamic. It gives a different picture to that. This does not include a dollar levy lid lift on this. But again, to the extent that we increase activities and bring on operating FTE, whatever it is, to the annexation area, that will shrink that positive variance moving forward. If we shift some things and we get the full $3.1 million from the sales tax credit, that's what this represents. It doesn't represent necessarily bringing on all of the expenses that would eat into that revenue. I think that's it for me, Tim. So happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we have one final slide, but before we do that, any questions for Aaron? You can certainly ask him after.
Go ahead.
So I'm just trying to make sure that I'm keeping this clear in my head. What I understood from the Echo Northwest study was that it comes out for over 20 year, their 20-year window at about a $3 million per year subsidy from the rest of the city, the rest of the taxpayers, to bring these folks in without promising them any new infrastructure. So I'm wondering both, what's the business case and what is the public benefit of having everybody else pony up a little more taxes so that they're city residents rather than not city residents? I'm just wondering what that is.
I was just going to say, Jay, maybe you're the better one to answer this question than me.
So I'll start with a few things. I think there's a few answers to this question. One is I want to start with the infrastructure question, because I think with the infrastructure piece that we talked about earlier, because I think that's a big one. So as was mentioned by Tim earlier, what's happening out there as new development happens in the southeast is being built to 1998 standards. And also what's happening is, because we're not collecting impact fees, as that infrastructure continues to deteriorate, it's deteriorating at a faster scale than it would if we annex that area. We start any new development from that point forward being built to our standards. We get to then roll that area into future transportation master plan discussions and start to figure out how we then bring some of those deficient areas back up to standard, just like we do with the rest of the city. Now, that's going to need a really big discussion about revenues. Now, we're going to have a TBD discussion around sales tax here next month for council that brings in some new revenue. The parks discussion around this, we've invested a lot in the park system already out in the southeast. And right now, as we've bonded for all those parks projects, the current tax base is footing the whole bill for those bonds. Once we annex, we bring in new revenues. Now, everybody, including the southeast, starts to help participate in the repayment of that debt and the enjoyment of those uses. So for me, the business case is when you think about the utilities that are already being served in the area, the parks investments that we've made, the fact that we're not building new development to our standards, that starts to make the business case from my perspective of why you would want to annex and why, without the sales and use tax credit that we get, Echo Northwest study does not take that into account. And so their $3 million deficit doesn't take that into account. And so having that, for me, it's what pushed me to this place of saying, now I'm in a position where I think we can move this forward because that deficit is made up for by that sales and use tax. Now, agreed, it's for a 10-year period. But I think as Aaron has showed you, over that 10-year period, we're going to need a revenue adjustment whether we annex the southeast or whether we don't. And the gap remains the same. And whether you bring in the southeast or bringing in the southeast doesn't significantly negatively impact the situation that we're already in. And Aaron, you can add to that if I missed anything there.
No, I think you got it.
Along those lines, Jay, you said the $3 million of sales tax that gets, diverted back to us, it has to be spent in that area.
It does.
So it could be used for sewer conversions, sidewalks, other infrastructure improvements, widening Wiggins, and $3 million doesn't go that far, but, yeah, I know. But it's like there's a benefit to them that has to be spent down there, no?
If I may, we're spending it twice then, because first we're talking about it offsetting the $3 million a year deficit that the Echo Northwest study, and then we're talking about having improvements made out there that we were going to figure out how to someday fund. But we're $3 million short a year just in providing police, fire, garbage, at least by my understanding of the Echo Northwest. So I don't want us to promise it twice the same $3 million.
Fair, thank you. I forgot with the fire coverage and the police, that'll eat up some of that. Councilmember Nguyen.
I'd be interested, I guess this would be to the city manager. I'd be interested in what the business case for residents that are currently in the city limits would be. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I think Tim touched on this a little bit. So One is there are likely services that they're not eligible for because they don't live in the city limits. Things like our access to the programs in our climate program that Dr. Braff is moving forward. They also would benefit by, in the future, being served by our fire departments in the future with a higher fire department rating. Can affect their things like their homeowners insurance rates and those types of things. They're able to vote in council elections, and they're able to more fully participate on a local level. Right now, their participation is more on a county level, so they're able to participate at a local level in the things that influence their way of life and the way they live. They're able to participate in our budget processes. A lot of them are receiving those services right now through our utilities, but probably don't spend a lot of time coming to our public hearings and talking about how they spend their money. And so I think there's a lot that they can contribute to that conversation as well. And there's probably a laundry list of other things I could think of, but that's kind of where I go to initially start with.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, thank you for that. I think that's important to know. And actually, I was asking the opposite. So what's in it for folks that currently, like Clark and I, that Clark lives on the west side, I'm downtown resident. So as the cost is going up, are there benefits for residents that are currently in the city limits?
Yes, so maybe the biggest one would be parks. So we've invested heavily in the park system out in the southeast. Yelm Highway, Trillium, Bent Ridge parcels, a lot of bonded measures to buy those properties that are paid for. Those are being enjoyed by people here and in the southeast UGA, but they're only being paid for by those that are currently here. So you now spread that impact over those that get annexed in. And so I think it lowers your cost as a resident here for how you pay for your park system, right? We take in more TBD revenue with that area. So as we bring more in, there's a benefit in how we maintain our infrastructure. So I hope that helps. I'm trying to off the cuff here answer that question. And looks like Leonard wants to jump in there too.
Well, I might add another, Leonard Bauer, Community Planning Development Director. From an environmental standpoint, the maintenance of things like stormwater ponds and, our critical areas regulations, which are not up to date is in terms of what the county's enforcement, our code enforcement, which may not be all environmental, but it is to some extent, all of those being provided to the annexation area benefits the region as a whole environmentally because our waterways and other things are being benefited from better maintenance, from higher enforcement and little tighter regulations environmentally out there as well.
I really appreciated the converse question, so I'm glad that played out the way it did. So the first way you answered that question, are those the reasons that people will sign the petition on property transfer? Like what, because to me it's intriguing that we already have 60%. Like that tells us we have a majority. If we can make the math work, we should move forward. But is there a different calculus when you're signing that in a land transaction versus how it plays out in your mind?
Well, the process that we're proposing is to use the interlocal process, right? But having lived in the UGA before I moved into the city limits, right, and having been a person who received city services and I signed on, right? So I think what you're saying is you're acknowledging at that point in time when you live out there and start to receive city services that you're acknowledging that you're receiving those city services and willing to pay a bit of a surplus if you don't sign on to that petition. And so I think, I can't speak for everybody that signs on, but I think that most people would find it a value add to be on city water than on a well water. There's a lot more predictability being on city water and receiving those city services. And so I think you're willing to then sign on to that because you know that you're getting a better high quality of service by joining into the city's system. So I hope that answered your question, but that's...
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I know we're not necessarily talking about that, but I think that's part of that logic for me. If that many properties have already signed in, then, the most challenging part for me in this is, besides the math, is negotiating with the county on an outcome. So I'm glad you have a year built in there on that.
Any other questions? Councilmember Parsley.
I've been kind of struggling with this because we heard it at finance too. And I was on land use in 2018 and 2019. So I've heard from both sides. See if I got this right. With that sales tax, it really, the impact on general fund is negligible. We will be struggling with the southeast as we are with the rest of the city for services and infrastructure and parks and sidewalks and roads and sewer and stormwater. It is a citywide issue, and that is the justification for the levy lid lift, is that we need to be able to provide the revenue to provide all those things for the entire city. The advantages of the annexation is both for the city, to a degree, spreading out the costs of the parks, and some of them are down there, and increased transportation benefit charges as well as MPD. But also for the city, I would add, we just listened to Pamela Braff talking about climate and getting buildings up to code and energy efficiency and electrification. If they're working off of 1998 zoning, they're not even in missing middle. They're not going to be in our EV infrastructure. So bringing them along so that we can service our region better for climate. I can kind of putting that together. My real question, I guess, is we obviously can't take action. Staff recommendation is to do that. When is that potentially scheduled?
We would need to bring a resolution to council to take action at a council meeting. And so it's currently not on the schedule, but we'd work to, if you decide to move forward tonight, we would work on a resolution to bring to council for approval.
Yeah, so we need a resolution to come for you to initiate an interlocal process with the county. So we will bring that. That's your first action. And it's important to note that isn't approval of the annexation. That's just approval to move forward to the next step, which is to negotiate an interlocal. The point in time where you get to approve the annexation is when we bring you an interlocal that we recommend to you that you think is fair and moves us in a process that meets our expectations. Part of that is we'll have to bring you updated financials based on what gets negotiated in that interlocal. The county could have a number of different asks in terms of timing and how things get phased in that annexation as they work through their own budgets. They're going to want to budget those impacts, and they may ask us for phasing of certain things. So it's hard to know. This moves us to that step. As I've mentioned before, I think it's going to take us most of 2024 if you move us that step to negotiate an interlocal agreement with the county, which means we're probably into 2025 before annexation if we got to a place where council could approve an interlocal.
And to add to that, while we negotiate with the county and other interested service providers, such as Fire District 6, we do have a piece in there for public engagement. And we do have money in our CPD budget to hire a consulting firm to help with that. Basically some outreach, education, and open houses to give the public an opportunity to learn about the annexation, ask questions. And that would happen before the public hearing process, which could be a joint hearing with the county. Both are required to have a hearing. You could do it jointly. And then after that, it's questionable whether it has to go to the boundary review board. We're clarifying that. But it could be a situation where following the public hearing and you adopt an ordinance that it goes into effect. But we're clarifying that currently. So the effective date we put on here was late 2024.
I see Mayor Pro Tem's hand up.
Can I bring Leonard into the conversation? And I'm wondering, the consultant report said this area is largely built up with limited vacant land and about 72% single-family houses that are less likely to turn over into something else. We had quite a bit of conversation about the advantages of impact fees or energy code, things like that. What is your redevelopment or buildable land sort of understanding of this area?
Well, we mentioned before that there was a real lag in the zoning. And so things like middle housing, ADUs, and those sorts of things are not currently allowed out there. So that would be one opportunity for redevelopment, as well as any remodeling and rehabilitation or additions that people do on their properties, on their existing homes. If I remember right, and Tim, correct me if I got this wrong, but I think that the consultant did include those vacant properties, some projection for development there, so that is included in the study. But the other is not, because they didn't have they were just going by the existing county zoning. So I think our biggest opportunity in this annexation area is the same as it is in the city, which is infill and rehabilitation and additions and remodeling and those sorts of things. And that's also our biggest opportunity for energy retrofits and building electrification as well. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I think we're closing in on this conversation. Thank you very much. I know this has been long time coming. Even when I first got on council, we were talking about what we're going to do down here in the southeast. And, you know, our understanding of growth management and what its goals are and why there are requirements for us to accept density. We know people that are coming, and that is not very dense part of town. Because it, like as you mentioned, it doesn't have more restrictive zoning under the county. That will give us more opportunities for building additional density in our city. So it's much needed. So I will close with that comment. And anything else?
Well, I'm just making sure we have good consensus amongst the council to bring you a resolution in the future. To move into the ILA process.
I just think from my perspective, you know, having sat through this in land use, and I want to commend especially Aaron's team for really beefing up the numbers. You know, to me, it's the gap is the same with or without the lid lift. So even if the voters don't approve that, you still have the similar distance between revenue and expense that we have citywide. And then if they do, you know, you see that gap reappear when the even if they do, you see that gap reappear when the sales tax credit, I'll call it, runs out. And so to me, it seems worthwhile to begin negotiating with the county, and so we have eyes wide open of what those numbers are, because I would be willing to bet something now that the number gets bigger when we get through that process. So I think it would be worth seeing that before we make any more decisions.
Councilmember Payne.
Yes, and along those lines, can we just start thinking about our communication strategy to the residents about this? Because I know it's almost 8 o'clock, but I'm staring at these graphs and numbers, and my eyes are crossing, and I'm just kind of like, what does all this mean? And, you know, just break it down in very plain language for people to understand what it is that they're getting out of this would be helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely noted. So how do you want to do consensus? Do you just want to like read our minds?
Well, I'll put it this way. I haven't heard anyone comment so far you're not willing to take this to the next place of negotiation with the county.
Not willing?
I haven't heard anybody say that you don't want to do that. So I'm taking that as move this to the next board, bring you a resolution to begin negotiations with the county on interlocal.
Just starting the next steps.
Yep.
No commitment, just next steps.
Yep.
Councilmember Juan.
Thank you. Yeah, and I heard from the city manager that you're actually thinking that the estimated annexation effective date is going to be in 2025. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Tim has an estimated late 2024. I'm less optimistic. It's late 2024. I think, you know, as I think about 2 new county commissioners coming on board, now a new county manager having to get hired probably shortly after the first of the year, I think we're well into probably almost mid-year before these negotiations really take off. So I think we're probably latter part of 2024 to bring you an interlocal that you could consider. And then if you said yes at that point in time, then annexation sometime in 2025.
Okay. I would just kind of piggyback on to Councilmember Payne's request about communication as we're thinking about it. And not only what the benefits are, but also, what can people realistically expect, right? So I understand all of the benefits for why we would annex the area and make sure that sort of those residents in the southeast area are taken care of, right? Just for easy speak. But then for current residents that are within the city limits, things are getting tighter. People are feeling the pinch in their wallets. There's this sort of looming, like, flying spaghetti monster that is a recession, and no one's really 100% sure when it's going to drop. And I see not just this, but a few more times that we might think about going to residents and asking for more money. So I just want to be really transparent early on about what exactly can you expect to see and why are we considering the actions that we're considering. Thanks.
I appreciate that, and I think as part of the public engagement, I think what comes to light with this conversation is we need both public engagement within the Southeast and public engagement within larger community around this. And so I think the questions that have come up tonight about really giving some careful thought to benefits on both sides and making sure we can really clearly articulate that are well stated tonight, and we'll take that under consideration as we move this forward.
And Councilmember Cooper.
It is a small logistical thing, so I would suggest if we're going to do this, that in January at the retreat, we identify 2 council members to negotiate with staff so that we can make sure that we have the bandwidth for the council member to commissioner conversations that will be needed to get it right. I'm going to guess that this would be the biggest interlocal we've ever had with the county.
All right, Councilmember Parsley, last comment.
I think going forward to see what the ILA can come up with is great, but I am going to echo these 2 council mates' communications, and you guys have heard me say this, not just about the annexation, but the levy lid lift. We really have to start working on the justification and why we're going there. And the projections of the next couple of years for the general fund, with or without the annexation. It looks like it's the same, it's identical.
And building into the conversation around the state's cap on our property tax proceeds. Yep. All right, thank you so much. It was great discussion on both topics, and we are now adjourned.